the university is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'd like to start by acknowledging the generous funding provided that makes this series possible by the College of Humanities at Brigham Young University and the Leslie Center for the Humanities at Dartmouth College. Yeah, what would we do without American private colleges funding? And I would like to actually thank our my co-organizers. I want to say that you know, I'm the kind of person who's normally more interested in thinking about what to eat today, what to wear tomorrow. Do I get a English arts and crafts buffet, or do I get a Chinese Art Deco rug? That's the sort of questions that I usually think about. But after they invited me and introduced me to these topics, especially the issue on decolonization, I really felt galvanized, and I really see that the dedication to this topic and to this initiative. So I very much appreciate that. And I also appreciate, obviously, all the contributions that the panelists have made so far to the series. So Simone, Marie, Graziella, and Matthew, thank you very much. And I want to make sure that we have a round of applause at the beginning of this round table, as well as the end, of course. Yeah, thank you. And yes, so 2 housekeeping rules. The first one is for the panelists. Please be mindful of the 10-minute limit, and my fabulous colleague Marie Orton will be raising her voice to give you a verbal reminder 30 seconds before. And the second thing is to the participants in this Zoom meeting, please send me your questions, and I will moderate afterwards. Wonderful. So our last roundtable is centered around the topic of race, critical race studies. Our first presenter is Kombola Ramadani Musa. She is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Cardiff University. Her recent work investigates the history of the Zigula as a distinctive and instructive example of African diaspora. In particular, it analyzes the case of the Italian Zigula, exploring the creation of post-colonial and multicultural Italian identities in the context of widespread racial prejudice. And the title of her talk today is Racialized Bodies, Vulnerable Subjects, the Italian Zigula. So welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I want to really thank the organizers for putting in place such a thought-provoking and inspiring event. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it? In my presentation today, I will talk about the Zigula experience in Italy, focusing in particular on 2 aspects. First, I will try to explain why it can be regarded as a post-colonial experience. Secondly, I will give some examples showing that the constant need to justify their presence in Italy and the lack of recognition make the Italian Zigula vulnerable subjects. I will start by giving a little bit of context. The Zigula, one of the most important ethnic and linguistic groups originally based in Tanzania, experienced a number of migrations, both within and outside Africa. At the end of the 18th century, to escape a serious drought, they left Tanzania for Somalia. There, the Zigula, or Somali Bantu, as they have also been labeled, live as an enclave, separated from the local Somali population, and they were colonized by Italians. While some Zigula left Somalia and returned to Tanzania to escape discrimination and exclusion, others who fled Somalia in the 90s after the beginning of the Somali Civil War eventually reached refugees camp in Kenya, A small number of them have been relocated to the US, while many are still waiting in the camps. During the Italian colonization at the beginning of the 20th century, as Francesca Declich points out, despite internal divisions and distinctions, Italian colonialists paid special attention to the descendants from slaves for their skill in farming. Even after the United Nations trusteeship under Italian administration ended in 1960, the Italian presence in Somalia was still of relevant importance. In this period, some young male Zigula had the opportunity to learn Italian, studying to become elementary teachers in Catholic institutions. Thanks to these relationships, and in particular to the connection with Italian missionaries, some moved from Somalia and Tanzania to Italy, where since the 70s, a group of Zigula settled and lives predominantly in Emilia-Romagna. The migration of the Zigula in Italy can be regarded as a post-colonial trajectory. So, paraphrasing a popular slogan, it could be said that Zigula are here because the Italians were there. In this regard, the Italian writer of Somali and Pakistani origin, Shirin Ramazani Fazel, affirms, I didn't go to Italy. It was Italy that first came to me. And you can read a longer quotation in the slide. The analysis of the discourse on race and how Black bodies have been racialized and represented in Italy requires an investigation of how racial ideas have developed since the liberalism period. The situation of Black people who live in Italy and of those who have started self-identifying as Black Italian or Afro-Italian is strictly related to what happened when Italians colonized African territories. The encounter between Italian colonizer and African colonized population has determined how even now Black bodies are perceived and Black people are treated in Italy. The invisibility of the bodies of colonized people on Italian soil before the 90s made it easier for Italy to distance itself from the legacy of colonialism, strengthening the myth of Italian as gentle colonizer, and helping to corroborate the assumption that being Italian means to be white or better non-Black. In this context, racism and Blackness did not acquire any centrality in the political and social debate which developed in Italy after the World War II. The discourse on race is broached with the same indulgent attitude generally applied to Italian colonialism. As Alessandro Portelli says, a combination of denial, paternalism, and innocence, which has argued, which makes possible in Italy things that would be unthinkable elsewhere. Italians still have the tendency to depict their nation as tolerant and to undervalue the importance of racial problems, stigmatizing any form of racism as simply the bad behavior of a few Italians. However, this image does not correspond to reality, and this can be seen, for example, if we focus on the legislation concerning Italian citizenship. Italian citizenship, which is granted by birth and is based on jus sanguinis, right of blood, is considered as one of the most restrictive citizenship laws for immigrants. Italian society still cannot conceive that Black Italians exist. Black people are instead mainly perceived as immigrants. The binomial association, which links being Black with being an immigrant, does not just exclude the right to be recognized as a citizen, but enhance the idea of the Black body as a foreign body. In this view, Black people's presence, if not regulated and constrained, could threaten Italian racial purity. I can here recall an incident that happened to me almost 15 years ago. I was at Fiumicino Airport in Rome, and I was waiting for my biological mother who was coming back from Tanzania. I was with one of my cousins, who is also a Zigula. It was late in the night, and there were a few people around, and the police stopped us asking to see our documents. I give them my Italian ID. They quickly checked my document before asking me to show them my permit to stay, which of course, being an Italian citizen, I did not need. I was shocked. Luckily, however, I also had my passport with me to further prove my Italian citizenship. They didn't not interrogate my cousin. He was a Black person with a Tanzanian passport, so his presence in this case was not as problematic as mine. Sarah Ahmed suggests that to fully comprehend process of racialization, it is necessary to examine the multiple stories that have produced the racialized body. Ahmed further argues, if Blackness is pathologized, we should also investigate what does it mean to inhabit a body that is seen as Black. In this regard, my focus on the Italian Zigula experience brings to the fore that the notion of Blackness is not a monolith, but present different facets. Within the Italian Zigula, there are Zigula who directly emigrated from Africa when they were children and were fostered or adopted by Italian families. Others arriving in Italy when they were already adults to complete their studies and to work. Among those who were born in Italy, there are also Zigula who are the children of mixed race unions. They all inhabit different Italian spaces in different ways. Telling and knowing their stories can be a useful instrument to understand different aspects of Blackness in Italy and to overcome some of the deep-rooted stereotypes about Black people. It also uncovers that identities, and in particular diasporic identities, far from being something fixed, are mobile and multifaceted. Because of the meanings with which their African features are invested, Italian Zigula often experience the feeling of not belonging and of being only regarded as second-class citizens in Italy. When, as happens frequently, someone asks them where they are really from, they usually say Tanzania, where their biological forebears now mainly live. They often feel forced to justify their being at the same time Black and Italian. One of the Italian Zigula I interviewed, who teaches the Italian language to migrants and refugees, told me that although she has Italian citizenship, she decides whether to tell her students she's Italian or Tanzanian according to the situation. At times, she says she's Italian when she intends to reaffirm her position as an Italian teacher, or if she wants to keep some distance from her students. On other occasions, she replies she's Tanzanian to show them her closeness and to suggest a common background. We do not always have the power to choose how to describe our identities. For Black people in Italy, the right of establishing themselves as citizens grapples with the possibility of being recognized accordingly. The Italian Zigula teacher I interviewed, if she had to, would probably define herself as Romagnolo Tanzanian, a label which evokes a sense of belonging and attachment to a local more than a national territory. This definition is the latest outcome of a long and never-ending process during which she has often questioned her identities and felt her vulnerability. Identities, as Stuart Hall pointed out, should be more about our roots than our roots. They should be regarded as an effort to illustrate the process of becoming rather than being, not who we are or where we came from, so much as what we might become, how we have been represented, and how that bears on how we might represent ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kombola, for your presentation. I'm always struck by those images of full-bodied lips of Africans, and I believe they're becoming of a trend. I wonder when, the almond-shaped Chinese eyes will be as well. But our next presenter, I also want to remind everyone to send me questions throughout the, especially for Kombola at the moment. Our next presenter is Catherine Adoyo. She is a lecturer at George Washington University. She received her PhD from Harvard University in 2012, and in 2020, she was a founding member of the Cosmopolitan Collective, which challenges the unspoken privileged and exclusionary premise of traditional diversity and inclusion initiatives. I hope we're not one of the traditional ones. The title of her presentation today is Neocolonial Subjective Gaze in Pasolini's Appunti per una Restiada Africana.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to share with you my slide presentation here, where you will immediately see that there's been an adjustment to my title. Can everyone see that? And a quick note about that. The neocolonial subjective gaze of Pasolini's Appunti per una Restiada Africana stays intact. But during the time, since I submitted the abstract and the title, and about 2 weeks ago, my my awareness of philosophical language that very effectively addresses the issue I'm talking about has grown immensely. And I'm very happy to share the bibliography of that with everyone later. So when I say the instrumental agency of epistemological ignorance, in the neocolonial subjective gaze of Pasolini's Appunti per una Resiede Africana, I'm referring to very, very specific philosophical ideas that I think are quite eloquent. Let us begin with a short clip.
Mi sto specchiando con la macchina da presa nella vetrina del negozio di una città africana. Sono venuto evidentemente a girare, ma a girare che cosa? Non un documentario e non un film. Sono venuto a girare degli appunti per un film. Questo film sarebbe l'Orestiade di Eschilo, da girarsi nell'Africa di oggi, nell'Africa moderna. Ho scelto per l'Orestiade di Eschilo una nazione africana che mi sembrava tipica, una nazione socialista, a tendenza, come vedete, filocinese, ma la cui scelta non è ancora evidentemente definitiva, perché accanto all'attrattiva cinese c'è un'altra attrattiva, non meno affascinante, l'americana, o per meglio dire neocapitalistica. Voi tutti conoscete la trama dell'Orestiade di Eschilo, la ripeto qui in poche parole e dirò soltanto i fatti. Siamo ad Argo, la città di cui è re Agamennone, che sta per tornare da Troia dove è andato a combattere.
So the opening image that we see emphasizes several interesting perspectival points that I'd like to emphasize. Pasolini introduces his location as Nazione Africana Tipica. He notes that it's a socialist nation that is China friendly, but with a marked American neo-capitalist strain. Pasolini then proceeds to tell us that he's going to summarize the myth of the Orestiade that he wants to use in Africa by starting dirò soltanto I fatti, I fatti. The image communicates the film's principal dual concerns, the author's self-interrogation and subjective reflection against the backdrop of a new capitalism in a rapidly changing Africa. Pasolini proposes to set the Orestia of Aeschylus in various locations as an allegory for the continent's transformation in the wake of the independence movements of the 50s and 60s. The tragedy of Aeschylus reflects, for Pasolini, Africa's evolution from a prehistoric tribal existence beset by atavistic terrors to a modern progressive culture thanks to Europe's intervention through the gift of democracy. From a philosophical perspective, Pasolini's film is an excellent case study of the instrumental agency of epistemological ignorance in imposing and sustaining the hegemony of an essentialized European narrative about the manifest destiny of its dominance and subjective supremacy. Pasolini's Appunti provides a convenient and contained example of what Miranda Freca calls epistemic injustice at work, where we watch the director's efforts to impose and enforce hermeneutic injustice, that is, the active silencing of a subject's firsthand experience to the point of making it unintelligible, unknowable, and irrelevant. Together with a series of scouting shots and proposed film treatment, Pasolini presents a panel of University of Rome students from various parts of Africa, welcoming their candid and often skeptical evaluation. By publishing proceedings of this colloquy in the Appunti, Pasolini effectively invites the critical observation of the wider secondary audience. Because of an important historical lacuna in the Italian filmmaker's analogy, Pasolini's initiative to adapt a Greek myth as an adequately universal analogy for Africa's proximate history is problematic. The film is conspicuously situated at the point of collision between myth and history in the European colonial enterprise in Africa. Unlike that of Aeschylus, the myth that emerges as a dominant point of interrogation in the Appunti is of a more recent European confection, the myth of the Dark Continent. Pasolini sees Africa and its native people as prehistoric And it is upon this conception of Africa that he bases his adaptation of the Oresteia. So Roland Barthes posits in the mythologies that mythology constitutes a system in which the myth is a secondary semiotic object. So while it is illusory and unproven, the myth is nevertheless meant to communicate a pre-established set of values and convey an arbitrarily assigned meaning at a hypodiscursive level. Charles Mills articulates a complementary idea in his description of the significance and the significance of conceptual prejudices in his essay, White Ignorance. I will only read part of this and leave the slide up. Concepts orient us to the world, and it is a rare individual who can resist this inherited orientation. Once established in the social mindset, its influence is difficult to escape, since it is not a matter of seeing the phenomenon with the concept discretely attached, but rather of seeing things through the concept itself. So it becomes possible to speak with no sense of absurdity of empty lands that are actually teeming with millions of people, of discovering countries whose inhabitants already exist, because the non-white has no subjectivity. In all these cases, the concept is driving the perception, with whites a prioristically intent on denying what is before them. So myth is the semiotic system in Pasolini's, as a semiotic system in Pasolini's Appunti, is operational on at least two planes. One is the overtly stated myth of an edifying European intervention in Africa proposed by Pasolini's Orestia de Africana, and the other is the covert myth undermining the legitimacy of the director's project, namely the myth of the Dark Continent. The second myth is central to the colonialist enterprise, and I think deserves more exploration. Its importance is even more fundamental since the author, by ignoring the history of colonialism in Africa, overlooks the primary reason the analogy he proposes cannot work. This analogy is based on a Greek narrative about the genealogy of democracy and, by extension, history and civilization. Todini notes that Pasolini postulates in present-day Africa a clash uh, much like the one that drives the movements of Clytemnestra and Orestes. But the drama imagined by Aeschylus undergoes significant changes under Pasolini's interpretive lens. The paternalistic attempt, the paternalistic attempt to reread the history of the other according to Greek mythology, his effort to make this mythology coexist with his ethnocentric political ideology highlights above all the poet's narcissistic need to be reassured and gratified. Pasolini's subjectivity is indeed central to this film. He arbitrarily superimposes significance on even natural elements of the landscape according to narrowly antagonistic concepts of Africa as the land of things backward and malignant. Such is Pasolini's representation of the natural landscape. The silent, windswept solitude of the African wilderness is said by him to evoke fear, as banana, palm, baobab, and acacia trees assume the role of the Furies under the filmmaker's gaze. And I have his words up on the screen for you to see. The question never occurs to Pasolini why, in seeking an allegory for the clash between different civilizations in contemporary Africa, he has to import a foreign myth rather than find an indigenous one to serve his storytelling purposes. He explains his choice of Orestea to the Roman student, saying that he recognizes analogies between Africa and the Orestiadae. The discovery that Orestes makes of democracy, bringing it with him, I'm sorry, it seems to me that African tribal civilization resembles the Greek archaic civilization. The discovery that Orestes makes of democracy brings it then to this country, which would be Argo, meaning the African country in the tragedy, and Africa in my film, is in a sense, let's put it this way, the discovery of democracy that Africa made in these last few years. Further complicating the matter is a question of language. When one of the Francophone students suggests equal terms of discourse in speaking about African nationalities, Pasolini's response is gravely contradictory in light of his proposed project. the filmmaker's declared intention to create a cinema di poesia in Africa is contradicted throughout the film when he declares, for example, the nature of my film must be deeply popular, yet the popular voice is conspicuously silent. Unlike other projects, like Comizi d'Amore, where the director speaks directly to subjects, Pasolini does not speak to the various players he envisions taking part in his Orestiade. Even in those moments when he is simply observing the natives and making note of universal social traits, the objects of his gaze do not speak. One particularly striking example is the shot of the barber and his client. Pasolini comments at this point, the characters in the choir will chat around the gas stations and their customers, curious children, tailors. Tailors and their customers, of course, talk a lot. They talk about the powerful, they talk about politics. All the while, the images on the film show people quietly going about their work, conspicuously silent, whatever sound they make drowned out by a clearly European, possibly Italian anthem on the soundtrack. When Pasolini says, we will not neglect, of course, the barbershops where, like all over the world, people have great conversations, the accompanying image of a man sitting beside a house facing a wall with the barber beside him also facing the wall, neither of them especially talkative, belies the author's narrative credibility.
Dr. Adoyo, I apologize for 30 seconds to
No problem.
conclude. Thank you.
No problem at all. So let me then draw this down to a conclusion. Perhaps the reason for the breakdown in Pasolini's project are the diametrically opposed conceptions of the conditions that led to the institution of Western democracy in Africa. Where Pasolini sees the encounter with Europe as edifying, Chinua Achebe dramatizes the deleterious effects of the transition in Africa from the atavistic tribal societies to the European model in spare, unsentimental terms in his novel Things Fall Apart. As Jan Mohammed has demonstrated, the search for new knowledge, the trip to Athens, when it happens, occurs under duress. It is not opprobrium, nor the search for protection from the white goddess that brings the young African to Europe. Whatever crimes he may have committed are not Europe's to absolve, and he is not reacting to his own primitive and old ways, but rather to the newly imported chaos incited by the colonial enterprise. One of these African travelers, the Roman students, a panelist in the Appunti, points out that Pasolini's reductive conception of Africa fails to recognize that Africa is too vast and too culturally heterogeneous for such a thing as the typical African setting that Pasolini seeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Please send questions about Catherine's presentation to me. And yeah, it's very nice to hear about Africa's role in 1970s Italian intellectuals' analysis of the United States and of America. And I think the same things goes for Antonioni in Zabriskie Point and his Chinese documentary film. But it's good to learn that Africa and ancient Greece also play a role in these dynamics. Wonderful. So our next speaker is Derek Duncan. He is a professor of Italian at the University of St. Andrews. He has published extensively on modern Italian culture, particularly on intersections of gender, sexuality, and of race and ethnicity in a transnational framework. He is increasingly engaged with developments in the creative humanities and in the fusion of academic research and creative practice. The title of his presentation today is By Way of Implication, La Difesa della Razza. So, Derek, to you.
Thanks, Gao, for that introduction, and thanks to all the organisers of this really wonderful series of seminars. It's been incredibly stimulating, and I've enjoyed it very much. The focus of my talk is ostensibly a special issue of La Difesa della Razza, which came out in 1942, devoted to the United States. This infamous publication is very often mentioned, but I suspect it's underread. Its graphics, its photography, and its illustrations, especially the covers, are striking and can easily be decoded to reveal its anti-Semitic and anti-Black message. But perhaps the defining anxiety is the fear of miscegenation or cultural contamination in any form. And I think this is what makes it of particular interest to people who work in modern languages. La Difesa was very much dedicated to the protection of the Italian race, and its project was underpinned by a transnational purview, if not exactly a methodology. There has been some academic treatment of the journal to date, but it has tended to isolate the journal and read it almost as a parenthesis. And I think it would benefit from a more in-depth intersection analysis, but that's not quite what I'm going to be doing today. As a kind of frame for my comments and the broader ambitions of the seminar series, I want to kind of like set out what my position as a researcher, as a teacher of Italian, as a modern linguist is, and summarize it in the following points, which kind of like stand as position statements, partly in response to some of the talks I've heard in the last days. First of all, I think it's essential that we start from the positionality of the researcher, teacher, or student to develop a critical understanding of Italianate culture as the outcome of situated knowledges. I think it's essential that we refuse the methodological nationalism of the area studies model of modern language study and its project of naturalizing language, culture, and territory. And I would also extend this to colonized and immigrant territories. And I think this is why Combola's example was so resonant here, by really problematizing even naturalized, colonialized geographies of Italy, which is our kind of like case study. And finally, I would say that before we move to decolonize Italian culture, we need to colonize it. We need to understand more fully the extent to which what passes for Italian culture is so fully saturated by a kind of epistemic violence of colonialism. And I think the work that Catherine's done is kind of like taking us in that direction. So first of all, I'd like to kind of like gloss these position statements by two different quotes, which kind of underline the question of subjectivity, the subjectivity of the student, researcher, and teacher, which is a very ill-defined element or positionality in processes of which we are perhaps not fully conscious and able to dominate, but in which we operate. And complicity is going to be a kind of like theme of my short presentation. The first quote is from Stuart Hall's fantastic memoir, Familiar Strangers. And it starts off, "My first sense of the world derived from my location as a colonized subject, and much of my life can be understood as unlearning the norms in which I was born and brought up. This long continuing process of disidentification has shaped my life." And I think Hall's memoir is a wonderful kind of narrative of his move from being a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford, and very much embracing kind of like the whiteness and the kind of like the culture of Oxford academia in the early 50s, to obviously occupying a much more critical and decolonizing stance. My second quote comes from a very different text, Karen Steedman's Landscape for a Good Woman, but it's very much focused on subjectivity and the hidden subjectivities which we need to perhaps remember and that we may sometimes encounter and feel. She writes, "I read a woman's book, meet such a woman at a party, a woman now like me, and think quite deliberately as we talk, we're divided. 100 years ago, I'd been cleaning your shoes. I know this and you don't." And if anyone, if you're not familiar with Carolyn Steedman's book, I would really recommend it. It's a wonderful text. But I want also to go back to my own starting points as an Italianist and reflect on the geopolitically situated knowledges that I'm trying to talk about. In my first year as a student of Italian at Aberdeen University, two of the set texts that we read are very relevant to the interests of La Difesa della Razza. Giorgio Bassani's Il Giardino dei Finzi Contini, which is very much written in the wake of the race laws of 1938, and Carlo Levi's Cristo si è fermato a Eboli, which very directly evokes the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. For a long time, though, I possessed this knowledge, the knowledge of the race laws and knowledge of the invasion of Ethiopia, as matters of historical fact rather than as tools to think critically with. And if I were to teach these two texts now, I would really want to think with them in a very different perspective. Two things I might do which reflect the situation from which I also speak and teach, would be look at Giorgio Bassani's novel in relation to Nathan Abrams' book, Caledonian Jews, Studies of 7 Small Communities in Scotland, which is a really insightful analysis to the small and quite idiosyncratic history of Jewish communities in Scotland, but also reflect on the fact that that book initiated quite a strong polemic around the fact that Glasgow and Dundee, 2 cities in Scotland, were twinned with towns in Palestine, and making Il Giardino dei Finzi Contini a very contemporary text for us in quite a different sense. If I were teaching Carlo Levi Sia Formato Ably, what I want to do is read it in relation to Massimo Mengisti's The Shadow King, which was published in Edinburgh last year, 2020, which many of you will be familiar with, but also look at the coverage of the invasion of Ethiopia as it appeared in the Scotsman newspaper in October 1935, because as well as giving a detailed and very critical account of Italy's invasion, it also contained articles reporting protests against Italian communities in Buenos Aires, in New York, and in Toulouse, very much in protest at the invasion. So very much transnationalizing the event itself and making it much more of a kind of global transnational affair. Moving on very quickly to the special issue of the race, or the issue of La Difesa della Razza, which came out in 1942. A couple of images there from the publication show give you an idea of what I mean by the striking nature of the graphics. It's very much an indictment of the United States, and it's divided into 5 thematic sections, which are listed on the right there. It expresses particular anxiety about racial mixing, but also political corruption, the health of the nation, and various other quite predictable things. If just go to the next slide, but sorry about this. What's particularly interesting, and just to give you a kind of like taster of this, under the 5th section, there's a short, which is curated by someone called Massimo Scaligero. There's a short article on lynching, which is taken pretty much verbatim from a piece by Emilio Cecchi, which appeared in 1938 in the Corriere della Sera, and is now included in his collection of essays about his sojourn in the United States, America Amara. Very graphic descriptions of lynchings in the United States are given. But what's really important is that, apart from the kind of like the intertextuality there, is the extent to which both Cecchi, and I'll say a bit about Cecchi in a second, and the essays in the work in this particular issue of La Difesa della Razza are underpinned by a similar bibliography. For example, the French author André Siegfried's America Comes of Age was translated into English in 1927 and was very widely read, and is very much a criticism of the melting pot in the United States. What's interesting too about the Difesa della Razza, and this became very apparent in 2018 when it received quite a lot of media coverage on the 80th anniversary of its publication and of the implementation of the race laws, was that this coverage largely jumped from 1938 right to the contemporary period to talk about far-right extremism and racist attacks in contemporary Italy. Now, while these are very important subjects and obviously need to be treated, what I was interested about was the lack of attention given to the journal itself, and which foreclosed very important questions of authorship and style. The writing in La Difesa della Razza is very dense. Despite the lurid covers, it's actually quite difficult to read, and a difficult journal to read. And I've used La Difesa della Razza in teaching with students, and they really do struggle with the Italian. It's very dense academic prose and very much at odds with the sensationalist graphics, which it's primarily associated with. But this does tie it very much in with, with the work of Emilio Cecchi, who is in many respects a bridge between pro-fascist literary culture of the 1920s and 1930s and the post-war period, because his contribution to Italian journalism, literary study, art history and cinema cannot be briefly summarized, and he enjoyed substantial recognition and acclaim both before and after the war. And it was only really
and giving you, I apologize for interrupting to give you the 30-second to conclude warning.
No, thanks, Marie. It was only with Bruno Pesqueda's monograph in 2015 that Cecchi's complicity with the regime was really brought to the fore. And it's really on this note of complicity that I would like to end. And I've been very much influenced recently by Michael Rothberg's study, The Implicated Subject, which looks at the ways in which those of us who see ourselves perhaps not as being directly implicated either as perpetrators or victims of any form of racial or colonial violence, nevertheless stand in relation to that. And he offers us the tools through which to think of our implication, our responsibility in that kind of like broader project. But I will finish with a similar reflection from Jackie Alexander's work, Pedagogies of Crossing. I wanted to finish on a pedagogical note because so much of what we've discussed over the last couple of weeks has been about teaching. In the introduction to her work, which is called On Living the Privilege of Empire, she concludes, perhaps empire never ended, that psychic and material will to conquer and appropriate 20th century movements for decolonization notwithstanding. What we can say for sure is that empire makes all innocence impossible. For Alexander, complicity is all about the subjectivity of the researcher and an acknowledgement of where we stand, not outside Italy as the subject of knowledge or inquiry, but in the folds where all innocence is impossible. Thank you, and sorry for those interruptions.
Thank you, Derek, for a very rich presentation. I especially appreciate the component on complicity, which reminds me of R.W. Connell's concept of multiple masculinities. And he explains how complicit masculinity is perhaps the most pervasive version of masculinity in the West. Wonderful. So let's move on to our next presentation. But before we do that, I'd like to remind you again to send me your questions about Derek's presentation. So our next speaker is Kenise Lyons. She is a lecturer at the Catholic University of America. She received her PhD from Yale University in 2012, and her book titled A Voice from the Margins, Reflections on a Sister Outsider on Her Voyage to Italy and Through Italian Studies is now in press. The title of her presentation today is Black Veronicas, Decolonizing Photography in Italy and Re-Representing Black Women Anew in Ijaba Shego's Adua and Mata Mengiste's The Shadow King. So over to you, Kenise.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very intriguing and interesting and provocative, as someone else has said, roundtable. So let me share my presentation. Okay. So I too had a bit of a title change based on additional research and reading and thinking. So the title has been adapted to Black/African Veronicas, and I have the Black/African in order to designate my understanding of the ways in which Black American women and African women in Italy have very different yet shared experiences when it comes to being in Italy. I will kind of explain that and give an example by saying when I'm in Italy and someone is being problematic, they'll say "Buongiorno l'Africa," And it is very interesting to think about the ways that even my American identity is automatically erased by my skin color in Africa. I mean, in Italy, I become African, which of course is no problem because I identify as a woman of African descent. That said, I am looking at photographic decoloniality in Italy and representing Black/African women anew in Ijabal Shego's Adjua and Ma'aza Mengiste's The Shadow King. So I want to talk about how I apply decolonial and womanist options to the study of Italy and its diasporas. And I want to begin this conversation by acknowledging and honoring the ancestral lands of the Nishantuk peoples from which I engage you today. I also want to acknowledge the African peoples for which I descend, whose origin and culture by design I do not know. And finally, I want to honor the decolonial struggle of those who have fought and continue to fight for equal and equitable access to educational institutions as both students and faculty, including Oliver and Linda Brown, Ruby Bridges, the Little Rock Nine, Perrin J. Mitchell, and especially Edward A. Boucher. So I am going to share with you some highlights around some work that I am doing centered on the analysis of a distinct collection of literary and visual texts, all generated and cultivated by Black/African women artists living and working within the cultural context of Italy and its many deeply interconnected diasporas. Though the experiences elaborate in the stories and the meanings that can be made from these stories are distinct and inherently plural as a result of the differing positionalities of their authors vis-a-vis the Italian cultural, historical, social, and linguistic contexts that shape them, there are some commonalities. So I see this body of work as sharing a common concern for the detection and depiction of the impact of colonialities of knowledge, being, gender, and sexuality on the bodies and lived experiences of those living subject to the colonial matrix of power, as well as the articulation of the ways the Colonial Death Project, enacted through the colonial matrix of power, legitimizes and accelerates modernity. I also see them as being joined in a common desire to delink or disconnect from coloniality and its power matrix and to think it otherwise. And they are also joined by this collective effort to reconnect, understand, and affirm, and here I'm quoting Walter Mignolo, quote, "The subjectivity is devalued by narratives of modernity that are constitutive of the colonial matrix of power," end quote. The main goal of which is, quote, "the transformation of colonial subjects and subjectivities into decolonial subjects and subjectivities that are then able to explore and end quote, that are then able to explore and set about creating decolonial options anchored in the, quote, reexistence, reemergence, reconstitution, and resurgence of pluriversality," end quote, as a universal option. The last thing that joins these authors is their common use of photography and other camera technologies as a means of disconnecting from this colonial death project. And I am using a term that I have encountered in the work of Sabelo Indolovu Gatsheni. And in addition to using photography to disconnect from this death project as manifested in Italy, and particularly the ways in which this death project figuratively and literally dismembers Black and African bodies of all kind, they're also using photography to reconnect to a decolonial praxis of living, thinking, and doing that recollects, remembers, and reexists that which had been previously torn asunder. And it's at this point I want to remark again through the work of Sabelo Indolovu Gatsheni, the ways in which this ongoing struggle to transcend the invented ontological split is persistent through coloniality, colonization, and return to coloniality. And this is a split that severed Blackness from whiteness and threw, quote, all those who were designated as non-white into a problematic liminal state of being characterized by a perpetual feeling of being incomplete or in a never-ending state of becoming, end quote. So Today's discussion is going to be briefly limited to commentary about how these elements show up in just two texts. Again, Ijaba Shego's Ajwa and Ma'aza Mengiste's The Shadow King, and the ways that their authors remediate photography, a medium inextricably linked to the elaboration of Italian colonialities of knowledge, being, and gender sexuality. And the ways they do so with the aim of engaging in, on the one hand, epistemic disobedience, or what Walter Mignolo defines as the exposure and subsequent delinking from the colonial power matrix on the one hand, and on the other, decolonial aesthesis. And decolonial aesthesis is a means of artistic production that, in opposition to colonial aesthetics, has sustained forms of being and forms of experiencing and relating to the world that are and have been in great danger under modern colonial rule. And I'm quoting from Mignolo here, attests both to the violence and the finitude of the modern colonial project, and finally empowers artists themselves to be theoreticians and conceptualizers of the prospective trajectories of decolonial being and decolonizing knowledge. And again, I'm quoting there. So my decolonial investigation into Shego and Mengiste's texts, I'm interested in covering how these two authors use photography to expose coloniality and its impact of its dismembering logic on the bodies of East African women, and delink from Italian photographic coloniality, which did not just end with colonization, and think Black/African womanhood otherwise, so as to not just disrupt and counter racist visions through the reversal of the gauge, as other post-colonial readings of Shego and Mengiste have argued, but to fully destroy its iconography, not just within the imagination of the colonizer, or even in the imagination of the colonizer, but that of the colonized, and do so in ways that rehumanize and re-exist Black/African womanhood, bringing it back to the fullness of life that coloniality and its death project initially denied. And do so, again, in ways that enable both the past, women of the past and the present, to become what Italian coloniality of gender and their own indigenous patriarchal societies never imagined them to be. So the decolonial analytics of my project are enacted from the title. Black Veronicas is a heuristic I'm developing for myself to understand how the photographic re-envisioning and re-existing of Black/African womanhood vis-a-vis the critical analysis of Italian cultural production. This analysis rightly affirms the trope of the Black Venus and calls for new imaginary, but has yet to, in any substantial way, reimagine Black/African womanhood. And I'm thinking of particularly the discourse of Italian studies of culture in the United States, particularly literary and filmic culture. So it is a heuristic I am developing on the heels of the work of Shirley Ann Tate, whose monograph, Black Women's Bodies in Nation, Race, Gender, and Culture, quote, revisits the racialization of Black women's muscle, bone, fat, and skin against the Black Venus, and through the trope of the subaltern figure of the sable saffron Venus as agentic alternative body through which to think Black women bodies otherwise. So I want to use the concept of the Black Veronica as a placeholder for a strategy of looking and image making that recognizes and then looks past the static image of the Black Venus, whose dynamics are already implied in not just by the medium it evokes, sculpture, but also the fragmented and grotesque state a la the Venus de Milo it also calls to mind. And I am not kind of avoiding or arguing that we have to stop looking at the Black Venus. That is just not the kind of impact that I want to have in my work. And I am really interested in using, again, this heuristic as a means of catching a glimpse of the ways that Black women artists, Black and African women artists, are representing the actuality of Black African women in Italy as they work to de-link themselves from coloniality and become other than the colonial power matrix perceives them to be. So we have a representation of kind of Black womanhood, Black African womanhood, and image making that is less of an icon of a static reality and more of a tableau of a living picture. And I am going through and just showing some of the ways that the imaginary shows up in very violent and dangerous ways in lived experience, and the ways that imagination, that problematic and difficult history continues today in this continued use of this idea of the Black women, of the Black Venus, to kind of hypersexualize and to desubjectivize Black/African women in Italy.
And
So,
I'm interrupting to give you a 30-second warning.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks
Dr.
so much. So in this project, I am really invested in understanding the ways that Shego and Mengiste are like Kiri-Mae Weems in her video and photographic installation. Roaming is re-envisioning Black African womanhood against the backdrop of kind of the fascist and colonial imaginary. And we, at this moment, I am really focusing on the narrative origins of the photographic frame. We know from both Shego and Mengiste that their novels were motivated by images that are included as paratexts, actual images in the case of Mengiste, and the description in the case of Shego. I really am interested in understanding the ways that they not only use these images to push back and disrupt a mythology and a propagandistic representation of the past and the colonial experience in Italy, but also to think about how they're using these images to shift the narrative frame. And here I'm paraphrasing from Mengiste as I close. Beyond the well-crafted narrative of coloniality and colonization, to understand ways that characters like Hirun and Adjua worked to create subjectivities that were not dependent on the imaginary of modernity, or operated on and formed by this imaginary, but instead they actively work to reconnect with a decolonial praxis of living, thinking, and doing, anchored in their own indigenous and deeply womanist epistemologies. I look forward to sharing the insights in the publication, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenise, for your presentation, and especially the fusion of activism, your artist projects, and scholarly insights. So please send along your questions for Kenise to me. Meanwhile, I'm going to introduce our very last but not least presenter of our roundtable, Heather Merrill. Heather Merrill is a professor of Africana Studies at Hamilton College. She is an ethnographer and critical human geographer who has conducted research focused on race, place, anti-Blackness, and lived experience in Italy for the past 30 years. Much of her fieldwork has been carried out in Torino and Reggio Emilia. She is the author of a book titled An Alliance of Women, Immigration and the Politics of Race, and another book called Black Spaces, African Diaspora in Italy. So Heather, to you, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'd like to first begin by acknowledging that Hamilton College was founded on Oneida land, and I want to honor that land. And I want to thank the organizers, all of you, for inviting me to this valuable series. It's been really interesting, and and rewarding. So thank you. And I also want to thank Matthew Green for his outstanding communications throughout. Yeah, for the sake of time, I'm just going to go here. You see, can you see my screen? Okay, I hope you can see that I've got one slide up. When widespread, I'm sorry? It's not up. Okay, I thought I had a slide up. You don't, I'm sharing. No?
To click on the PowerPoint slides, now we're seeing your face, but not the slides. Yes, now
okay. You see that. All right, great. Great. Now I'm spending more time than I want to here. So when widespread protests against systemic racism erupted in the United States following the murder of George Floyd, they resonated with people around the world who expressed empathy and solidarity. In Torino's Piazza Castello, here we go. Thousands of people sat in 8 minutes of silence, the amount of time they believed it took for a police officer to choke to death Mr. Floyd while holding a knee on his neck. They shouted while holding up fists, "No justice, no peace," held signs proclaiming "Black Lives Matter," "No freedom till we're equal," and notably, "Silence is violence." In interviews with the local press, 2 African-Italian women and a man spoke about being moved upon observing so many people joining their protest against racism, something they'd never seen before. They said they needed this support to be sustained in order for Italian society to confront and reckon with the racism they have endured alone. A young woman whose parents are from Somalia disclosed that for the first time in her life, she felt as if Torino were her city, her home. Growing up as a Black girl, as she described, she always felt alone and, like so many others, never listened to. This solidarity demonstrated that day gave these African Italians hope that in Italy and throughout the world, everything was finally changing. What strikes me about these comments is that young people spoke candidly about the anti-Black racism they experienced daily in Italy, without fear of being dismissed, ostracized, or in some other way silenced. For these moments, they felt affirmed and supported by other Italians. Their perspectives derive from their lived experiences in Italy, which are essential for us to consider in any rethinking and decolonizing of Italian studies. Many African Italians, transcultural people from former Italian or European colonies and China, inhabit what Graziella Parati describes as a troubling and ever-increasing racism in Italy. Parati, Graziella, wrote this in her introduction to Embarrassement by Togolese Italian physician and writer Cosi Comla Ebri, translated into English by Marie Orton. In the book's preface, former Italian Minister of Integration and member of the European Parliament, Cecilia Chieng, who is Congolese Italian, writes that every person of color in Italy has their own rich repertoire of embarrassment, which, like offensive faux pas, create uneasiness. They express judgments and prejudices that wound their victims because they occur daily and because they illustrate a common mentality that is packed with stereotypes. Cumulatively, experiencing stereotypes in action, along with the dearth of positive images of Blackness in Italy, can have discouraging, even debilitating impacts on young Italians. It can be quite grueling, for example, to deal with the experience of what Dienke Hondias, in describing the Netherlands, called the repetition of surprise, a sense of astonishment when recognized white Italian subjects meet African origin Italian subjects in Italian spaces. Such repetitive surprise allows anti-Blackness to flourish on long-standing modern foundations. And this is all facilitated by pervasive, demeaning, popular cultural, in this case, media representations that suggest a spectral presence in which the actual people are absent. They are there in Italy, but not really seen or heard. 2 recent television series seem to offer alternative viewpoints. The Rai Uno Netflix series Nero a Metà and the Netflix series Zero. Both explore issues of anti-Blackness and belonging in Italian society. Nero a Metà, created by Giampaolo Simi, is a crime drama set in Rome, co-starring Claudio Amendola. Yes, in case you haven't seen, and Miguel Gabo Diaz. Diaz is an Italian actor of Dominican origin. The Netflix series Zero, which I would call Afrofuturist, is written by African-Italian novelist Antonio Deschelli Di Stefano. Set in Milan, Zero is the first Italian series with a majority Black cast. I ask how these two series represent the complex lived experiences of Black Italians as members of Italian society, and what movements they make, if any, in advancing a racial reckoning. The series Nero a Metà is translated for English-speaking audiences as Carlo and Malik, but its translation from Italian is half Black. This is interesting, for by employing the term Black, which is emerging as a self-description, it suggests a collective diasporic identity. The title also indicates that Blackness is a central feature of the storyline. Our introduction to one of the two main characters, Malik Soprani, played by Miguel Gabo Diaz, is through a stereotype. We see Malik walking rapidly and with intensity on a graffiti-flanked urban street, wearing a Black hoodie and jeans, which aren't considered stylish in Italy. But there's something about Malik that suggests he's not what he appears to be, even when we see him interacting with other Black and brown men who seem idle and or engaged in illegal drug transactions. While driving to his office, the other main character, Police Inspector Carlo Guerrieri, played by the well-known actor Claudio Amendola, perceives Malik as a drug dealer and runs to arrest him, but he gets away. While having a sketch of Malik made, Carlo says he can't discern differences between Blacks, yet the details of the likeness belies his claim. We next see Malik in an upscale, well-appointed apartment, his jeans, hoodie, etc. on the floor, and he opens a drawer full of pressed tailored shirts that indicate an insider status. The first time Malik and Carlo meet, Carlo has a pistol in his hand, and he tackles to the ground and hits Malik in the face with the gun. Malik then reveals that he too is a police inspector, Malik Soprani, and Carlo appears dumbfounded. The case involves a murder, and the two inspectors are told they will work together to solve it. Carlo is unhappy about working with Malik, yet one of his three teammates, a young man, knows Malik as the top student in his police academy and greets him warmly. Thus, we see here that while the middle-aged Carlo has a quite stereotypical ideas about who can and cannot be an Italian inspector, a young generation may be more accepting of the changes Italy has undergone over the past several decades. The issue of who can and cannot belong in Italian society is prominent in this series, and the racist slights African Italians endure are written into the story. After the younger police officer calls Carlo on his racism, Carlo accepts Malik so much that at one point he states that Malik is as, if not more, Italian than he is. Also notable is that Malik is represented as quite attractive to recognized Italian women. Yet because his character is not developed as genuinely Italian, this suggests an ambivalence about the inclusion of Black Italian men in mainstream Italian society. In some ways, the series moves the needle in its representation of Malik as Italian. However, it also adopts a number of problematic stereotypes, at times objectifying Malik and representing most other Black characters in stereotypical roles as desperate, destitute, or criminal. The Netflix series Zero, set in a predominantly immigrant or Black Italian neighborhood, breaks more new ground than Nero a Metà. Almost all the lead characters and cast are young Black Italians educated in Italian schools, and their principal languages and cultural references are Italian. However, and as the series title suggests, they are visible in Italian society. Donald Carter, in his exploration of African diaspora, describes invisibility as a form of social erasure, a way of making the seen disappear in plain sight. Author Antonio Deschelli Di Stefano, who is Italian of Angolan heritage, adopts a similar rendering in his depiction of lived experiences of Black youth in Italy, who have trouble communicating across cultures with their own parents, yet are, as the main character states in an opening scene, invisible in that nobody notices them or their neighborhoods. The main character, Omar, played by Giuseppe Dave Secco, has the power to become literally invisible. Omar has a passion for drawing Japanese manga-style comic books with Black protagonists. In a telling scene, he is invited to dinner by a woman he met while delivering pizza to the home of a wealthy family. He expects an intimate dinner, but when the door opens, he finds that the dinner is instead a party with hundreds of recognized Italians. And upon seeing him, one young man screams, "The Coke is here." As Omar makes his way through the crowd, he is thinking, Omar, the pusher, the street vendor, the thief, the waiter who serves you drinks. What's worse, to be mistaken for someone you're not, or not to be seen at all? When Omar realizes his extraordinary power of invisibility can enable him to take actions that address social justice for his friends and family, he adopts the name and role of a superhero, Zero, at once accepting and embracing his identity. This is a story that, in the lexicon of Afrofuturism, envisions the shape-shifting abilities of Black Italians, the ability to transform social invisibility into strength, survival, and vision.
Excuse me for interrupting to give the 30-second to
Okay,
thank
great.
you.
I'll be right on time. Thank you. To conclude, the narrator of a video about Black Lives Matter and the Reckoning in Italy by Vice News describes a pre and post George Floyd consciousness in Italy. Angelica Pesarini, in her interview by Camilla Hawthorne, and also yesterday when she spoke, has said otherwise. And indeed, it's quite possible that the social shift exists principally among African Italians. Yet, it's hard to argue that we are at an historical inflection point when we have the opportunity to substantially transform our world. We can seize this moment, and create what Angeline Young has called the new Italian studies, incorporating Italian society more fully into Italian studies, including the lived experiences of new Italians and challenging the prevailing racial order. We can counter social problems like the growing atomization of Italian society and the advance of authoritarian populism by studying and teaching the complexity of Italian history and the historical present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather, for your presentation, especially your up-to-date analysis on Zero Netflix series. So we are a little bit late today, so I think we will go over time a little bit, maybe 10 or 15 minutes after 11 o'clock, so that we'll be able to do a proper Q&A session. But before we hit the Q&A session, I'd like to just wrap up our roundtable series by saying that we're going to publish a lot of contributions from these presentations in Italian Studies in South Africa as a special journal, as a special issue in the journal. My colleagues have also asked me to say that we do not aim to make this series exhaustive in terms of covering the themes about diversity and decolonization in Italian studies. However, we do aim to engage and encourage intellectual collaborations and interpretations about how concretely we can change the way that we teach, we represent, and we advocate with reference to Italian studies. We also examine the different ways that belonging is experienced and framed in relation to particularly issues of positionality. In order to promote decolonization, we can also use transnationalism and interdisciplinarity as intellectual instruments. And several of panelists today have talked about how to decolonize our pedagogy in Italian studies. This is another highlight. The final observation that we all share is this collaborative approach to Italian studies, both among scholars on academic publications, but also between scholars and communities in various places where Italian is taught. So yeah, so that's sort of our kind of departing thoughts about the series. Now let's proceed to the Q&A session. Also, please send your question about Heather's presentation. I think what I will do is to pose one question for each of the presenters today. I have received several questions for each person, but I would just have to select one question. So the first question goes to Kombola. And the question is about the diaspora of Zigula in Emilia-Romagna, particularly because of the region as a stronghold of communism. And the person who asked the question wants to understand a bit more how the communist anti-fascism of Emilia-Romagna both enabled connections with African societies in the process of decolonization and obscured the history of Italian colonialism there. Would you like to say something more about this double process?
Okay, I can say something about the Zigula experience in Emilia-Romagna, and I want to stress the fact that, as probably some of you know, in Emilia-Romagna there is a kind of division, which is not an actual division between communist or people who recognize themselves as communist and Catholic. And the migration of the Zigula to Emilia-Romagna was more because of the Catholic side of Emilia-Romagna, because many of the people who arrived in Emilia-Romagna in the 70s were actually converted Christian. So this was the main channel through which they arrived in Tanzania, in Emilia-Romagna. And I think that because there are some other Zigula in other part of Italy, and I think it's the same also for them. It was through Catholic institution and was through missionaries. I don't think that in this sense, the fact that the region is, it probably had an influence in the way they were welcome and accepted. I think that the presence, the coexistence of some left-wing ideas and religious Christian ideas made the presence of the Zigula and the way they were welcome probably from some aspect easier, and it's not the right way, but they were very welcomed, and then there were some other issues which are not probably related to the question, but this was the situation.
Thank you, Kombola. And my next question is for Catherine. So the question says, what do you make of Pasolini's choice to preface this work with the idea of appunti? This is also how he frames another project, Appunti per un film sull'India. Do you see it as a hesitation, an awareness of his collaboration with neo-colonial structures? Or is it just a form of Orientalism with the appunti suggesting some form of travel diary in the spirit of the long tradition of European travelers in Africa or India?
That's a fantastic question. And I think the title itself, Appunti itself, points to the stratified sort of multiple framed narratives within the film, right? At the core is supposed to be the myth of Orestiade, which is supposed to be set in Africa, and the story that we get is at the next diegetic level is following the travel narrative, if you will, of the director scouting to find the right shots, the right characters, the right look, sort of designating characters as we go along. And then the next diegetic level, right beyond that, the next diegetic frame is him then presenting these notes, this project, this treatment to a tribunal of African Orestes, right? The African students. So the Apunti is, I love this question because the Apunti really does point to those multiple frames, one inside another. It's a very Boccacian thing to do, I suppose, right? And the other part of the other important element of the title Appunti is that I don't know so much as hesitation as preparation, right? So it marks a because of the nature of the project and the content, it takes us on the journey of the beginnings, the raw material of what ought to eventually be that project at the center, but it's nevertheless aborted along the way because of the dialectic that he enters into with that ultimate tribunal, the Roman students. So going back to the original question, is it hesitation or something else? I think that after the fact, after having prepared and then presented to the tribunal his multiple diegetic levels of preparation, I think that Pasolini, in publishing this film, actually invites interrogation and opens the door to examination of that neocolonialist gaze. It's not an accident that the film begins with his reflection on the glass holding the macchina da presa. And so there are a lot of visual semiotics that suggest a self-interrogation, a self-reflection, but in a backdrop where the ultimate tribunal that renders judgment on his project are those displaced Africans who ultimately tell him that the project can't work.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for your explanation. My next question is for Derek regarding pedagogy. And the question says, in proposing a new syllabus containing key tests to expand the discussion on what you're teaching, can you share your experience in teaching such a curriculum in practical terms?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a sort of key question for us all, really. I don't know quite how to respond to this without going into details, but I think an important element is that we just actually make the changes. And if we introduce them from the start of the syllabus, we don't force students to kind of like bridge a change in syllabus. I think we just need to be bolder in what we decide to teach. But I would want to say that I don't think just curriculum change in itself is enough. I think we've got to look at our bibliographies, our methodology. A short story by Ijabashego, for example, to the existing syllabus, unless we actually change our approach and adopt a more rigorously and vigorously decolonizing methodological apparatus to our work. And I think, you know, we've got to ask these questions of the kind of standard text which we might have on an Italian syllabus, well, you know, whether it's kind of like Verga, Carlo Levi, Svevo, any of these kind of like, you know, the staples of kind of like modern Italian literature. Similarly to questions of cinema, I don't think just changing primary text is actually enough.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you, Derek. And my next question is for Kanis. So in Adwa, which is the novel that you discussed, it has a lot of depictions of, you know, disturbing sexual violence. How do you see that subject in relation to your project? How do you negotiate with that?
I think that the ways I am planning on negotiating it is to be thinking about the ways that there is a tie that is constructed between the photographs, particularly the photograph of the little sister and the kind of sexual violence that is kind of enacted against Zolpe through that image, kind of prefigures, but also creates a frame in which to kind of understand the sexual violence that Adwa experiences. I am particularly invested in thinking about trauma and thinking about trauma with the help of kind of trauma studies, but also the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, who is kind of helping me to understand the ways that it is the representation or the representation, the going deep into the wound, as being the way in which to kind of address the wound and heal it. So I think that that is what I'm thinking about so far.
Mhm. Wonderful, thank you. So Heather, we have a question for you. So Nero, a metà, and Zero are very different in that they use different platforms. The first is a RAI production distributed through so-called old media television. Netflix, is targeting a very different age group and audience. Do you think there may be something interesting in trying to complicate the racial representation as something mainstream, as sorry, the question, the sentence is getting a little long. Trying to simplify a little bit for you. Whether how to complicate the racial presentation, I guess, between the kind of more mainstream poliziotto, carabiniere, Italiano type of television show. In the classic moralistic primetime RAI series, mainly are aimed at an older family public. I guess the question is about, the RAI show perhaps aiming more at a family public, and the Netflix show maybe targeting at a younger audience, and whether racial representation changes, negotiates with that those formats. I hope
I was muted. Yes, thank you. That's a really interesting question. That's a great question. I will say that the Nero e Metà was also co-produced by or supported by Netflix, and it was supposed to be international. And I don't know what happened to that, because it is one of these. It is also a crime drama, which are very popular, but not in the way that this sort of graphic sort of storyline is with superhero story, which is definitely geared to a younger audience. And I think, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure how to respond exactly, because I haven't given this much thought. but I will say that I think that reaching a larger, I think it is actually, well, I'll say this. Reaching a large audience the way that Zero does is really actually quite path-breaking, and the fact that young people can identify with this kind of a storyline. I mean, I actually showed the first episode in one of my classes, and the students just loved it. They thought it was really interesting, and they wanted me to show more of it. And it's something that is a familiar genre, not so much Afrofuturism, although as I was describing it that way, more of the students were interested in pursuing watching more Afrofuturist shows. So it's kind of, I think it's it reaches a larger audience, and an audience that at least over what I've experienced, particularly over the past year since George Floyd was murdered, and is that the students are much more open and interested in general, to about these topics. And I'm talking about from a predominantly white school that I teach, institution that I teach at. And so I think that it's a smart move. Di Stefano also, who wrote this, is a novelist, a well-known novelist in Italy. And talking about curricula, is interesting to look at some of his material. And he's also a rap artist. So he's already sort of, speaking a language for younger. He's young. He's something like 26 years old. And I think, you know, the more we bring people, students, young people in, you know, and they really are resonating and they're on social media and you know, they watch a lot of these Netflix series, and it also brings it, you know, it's very good for them. It's good for affirming. It's all very good for Black Italians to see it, and for others to see that, you know, these are Italians that are in Italy, and so, you know, I hope that older people, you know, also are interested in watching something like that. But I think, you know, it's effective, and to do it the way that DeStefano, you know, this was his vision. I mean, and he's trying to reach as many people as possible, but he's also talking about his own lived experiences in Italy. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a very interesting one. But thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Heather. As I said, we might run over a little bit, 10 minutes or so. So I'd like to maybe have a second round of questions, and I would ask everyone to be a little bit more brief in your answers. So for Kombola, again, the question is about whether you could elaborate on affiliating oneself to a regional identity might present us with the possibility of envisioning a less threatening Italian Blackness. Can or could regionalism be the way to subvert whiteness?
I'm not sure if I got the question right, but I can answer like saying that I don't think that, as I say, I don't think that roots origins are so important. I think that we have to, I just read an interview with Komi Baba, and he said that we have to move away from the idea of permanence, and we can start thinking, for example, about the temporal span of the refugees when we talk about identity and identification. So I think that probably the fact that we are always constrained, or we are always forced to justify our presence, has to be challenged in a kind of broader and different way. But I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. And next question is for Catherine, if Catherine is still here. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Cosmopolitan Collective?
Oh, certainly. Well, the Cosmopolitan Collective is an aggregate of various scholars from around the world, really, right now. And we started, the core root started with Italianists. We had come together in part in a conference that was hosted at the Calander Institute in 2019. That was Diversity in Italian Studies, a conference that had been catalyzed by an article that Deborah Parker wrote called basically Diversity in Italian Studies and problematizing the issue. So the director of the Calander Institute, Antonio Tamburi, hosted this conference, and an incredible number of scholars from all over the world came and participated in this. It's available on YouTube if anyone hasn't seen it. And then after 2019, this was January 2019, I think we all went about our separate ways, and the Calander Institute went into the process of publishing the proceedings of this conference, which came out just about a month and a half ago. So that too, you can get a copy of and get some really rich scholarship in. Fast forward to summer of 2020, and on a little parenthesis, I know you want me to be brief, so I will try to condense this as much as possible. Since 2016, I have been finding in many social movements for justice, many instances where individuals or groups decry injustice. I've been finding resonance with Dante's poetry, with the Commedia especially. And so I got into this habit of making memes or posters that would include images of these protesters with a passage of the Commedia. And my response to so many statements of solidarity in the post-George Floyd murder uprising statements of solidarity, many of which I found quite hollow, right, was to turn again to Dante and find the moment where Dante is encouraged to speak the truth no matter what it costs. And I created this meme and posted it on Facebook, mostly as a cathartic exercise. And many of the agents, the actors, the scholars who had been at the Calandra Institute, upon noticing that, we all sort of gravitated together. And we created this collective. So we want to, through principles of inquiry, through the practice and exercise of humility and radical self-interrogation, really examine the status quo, examine our complicity in the existing injustices of the status quo, and then engage other and different voices, engage different voices and different intellectual perspectives and different creativities in a much more collective, much more cosmopolitan approach to our pedagogy, to our scholarship, and in my conception at least, to a more just world, right? So I hope that answered the question, and I hope that anybody who didn't know about the Cosmopolitan Collective before is just dying to run and come and join us. So you can find our manifesto online. While this panel continues, I'll dig up the link and I'll put it in the chat so anyone can come and see what we're all about. Okay, thank you so much for the question.
Thank you. And a question for Derek. Okay, so the question is, can you expand on the reasons for your objection to area studies, even as you argue the need for decolonizing Italian culture?
I think my objection to area studies, and I think there's a difference in terminology between how area studies is used in the UK and how it's used in the US, but I think the point would stand. It's to do with the methodological nationalism which underpins the disciplinary project. I think adopting, say, a transnational perspective, and it is a perspective, it is a methodology, it's not saying, it's not giving greater truth or anything, allows us to be kind of more fluid in our thinking and allows us to go beyond the kind of nationalism which sort of underpins some of the issues which the other speakers have been talking about tonight and in the other seminars about claims to Italianness. I mean, there are practical things around citizenship, but not, there are different questions around Italian identity and who has authority over Italian culture, for example. I mean, my approach to Italian is very much an approach to modern languages, and I would really only be using Italian as a kind of case study, because I think the conversations that we're having really apply to modern language as a disciplinary field in general. I happen to be an Italianist. I think I would have the same issues were I in French or in German or dealing with any other language. So, I mean, really, it's not an objection to area studies, but it's a perception of its limitations as a kind of like delimiting field, which we need to put some pressure on. I could say lots about this, but I don't think I would really want to take up more time. It's a very complicated question.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Derek. And Kanice, unfortunately, has left the Zoom meeting because she had an important meeting to join. So I will pose my final question, which is for Heather. Do you see remnants or uncanny traces of fascist and racist colonialism in either of the two series that you discussed?
That's a great question. There's traces of this in everything, I guess. That's all I don't say. And I don't think that the maker, I mean, Yeah, I mean, the one thing is in the Zero, I mean, if any of you seen that, I know that just came out. I was very anxious to try to watch it before the roundtables. There's a statue that is of an immigrant that's in this neighborhood outside of where these kids live, which is on the margin of Milan. And you know, there are references that are going to the you know, you're gonna have to tell me, all you specialists remembering right now, of the man who's there's all this conflict over this former journalist who was a fascist, really, who's there's a lot of, you know, who's the kids, you know, threw paint on, and then the mayor of Milan refused to remove it. And so there's references to a critique of fascism, certainly in Zero. But you know, and colonialism, Italian colonialism. Thank you, Indro Montanelli. Thank you very much. That's who that was, right? But I am not sure, you know, whether or not, yeah, that's a very good question about the first one, whether you see that. I mean, it's in everything, really, just in the kind of relationships that people have and the attitudes that one has towards African Italians, and this kind of paternalism and so on that goes on. So I think that but I can't tell you specifically that any of that struck me. I guess I'm always, you know, I've done, you know, this is an important problem in the country. And so it's a great question to be asking about everything we see visually. So for all of you who are teaching this, that's a good one to continue to interrogate anything that we discuss with students. And I think popular culture is really important to discuss with students. So that's the best I can do right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather, for your thoughts. And once again, I'd like to thank all the panelists today for helping us to think about race and the legacy of racism in contemporary Italian culture. And thank you for sharing your various projects with us. And also thank you everybody for tuning in today. This is our very last roundtable, but discussions will continue once we publish. And did I see Catherine raise her hand? Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I just posted on the chat the links to the manifesto, to our listserv, to our Twitter account and Instagram. The latter two are still finding their sea legs, but the manifesto will give you all the information you need about what the Cosmopolitan Collective is about. And then the listserv will be a great way to keep in touch and updated about meetings and initiatives, and even like join in to make suggestions and lead new initiatives. So thank you very much. Let me just finish by saying thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to all my co-panelists. It was absolutely wonderful and just enlightening. We have so much to talk about, and I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, conversation will continue for sure. Yeah, thank you so much. Grazie mille. Arrivederci. Alla prossima.
Sì, sì.